Hello everybody and welcome to another dual book review here on the channel. I am your peachy goblin reviewer, and today we have a sci-fi and a fantasy book to talk about. We're going to have Old Man's War and Pawn's Gambit. We're going to go ahead and start with Pawn's Gambit. So this is the second book by author Rob J. Hayes that I have read. You may recognize his name because we're constantly bringing him up here on the channel for the work he does for the self-published author community. Every month, Rob J. Hayes puts out a really outstanding list of self-published books for you to check on out, and of course, he self-published this book, Pawn's Gambit. Now, Never Die I already liked. That was a previous release from the author, and I was quite the fan of it. It had a bit of a feel that I commented on in that review, but Pawn's Gambit is absolutely in every way, shape, and form a step up from the author. Not to disparage Never Die, but Pawn's Gambit, wow! Rob J. Hayes is evolving and improving as an author while leaning into his strengths. Let's go ahead and get into that. This book is about gods selecting humans to act as champions for them in a competition to see who will take the Jade Throne. Not related to that. And on face value, even though this is just my second Rob J. Hayes book, that is such a Rob J. Hayes concept. I can tell what this guy enjoys writing, and I like that he leans into it. Know what you're good at and make it your thing. Brilliant. Our main protagonist, Yu, is chosen by the god of missed opportunities to go into this competition and find the most magical relics to win for this god. A very honest compliment I can give this book that's already going to sell it to a lot of people is it rides this line absolutely phenomenally, where we have a very stylized approach to the writing. It feels like Rob J. Hayes' writing, but that hand is never so intrusive that it actually interferes with your immersion as the reader. This is something a lot of authors struggle to find a balance of, and man, Rob killed it. Absolutely on veteran level status. He knows how to write his way without ever actually intruding with your ability to experience the world. So much praise for that. And in the previous book, Never Die, we were kind of just thrown into the world without too much setup. That book was very much so reliant on readers picking up information as the story unfolded, and I like that this book went away from that pattern. Don't get me wrong, I love information that you pick up as the story progresses, but setup is there for a reason. It lets the author not have to do as much legwork while the story progresses and can make the pacing just feel much more natural. And I think Pawn's Gambit has that because, yeah, the beginning's a little more slow, but it's because we're actually having the stakes established, and it's not something that has to be taken care of later on. In fact, I think Pawn's Gambit is going to be a book a lot of people say, like, I liked the first half. I loved the second half, and I think the second half is just reaping the benefits of what the first half built up. Obviously, duh, that's how books work. I'm just saying it's a very, very solid example for people who want to look at writing in this way of how doing a lot of legwork early on can just mean towards the latter half of your book or series, what have you, you can just reap all these delicious benefits. This book is also very philosophical in a lot of its meanderings. There's gonna be quotes you pull out of here, and I'm not sure if many of them are Rob J. Hayes' own original ones or if he's just twisting, pulling from real world examples. I don't know every quote, but I like the implementation here. We have a lot of characters that are really gonna make people think, and yeah, it's definitely still like an action-packed adventure, but there's this really great balance within this story of it is like the fantasy, fun adventure tale, but there's not any lack of depth. I haven't even gotten to the characterization yet. It's a joy across the board. Everyone has distinct personalities, and while motivations can be a bit weak with certain characters, it does fit in with what's built, so I'm not going to complain too much about that. Relationships are well realized, not the deepest ever, and I enjoy who was brought to us. It's a nice little palette of characters that you're going to have a good time with. That's kind of one of the massive appeals of the Mortal Technique series that Rob J. Hayes is building here. Now, the most common critique I saw of Never Die, and one that I mentioned in my own video about it, was that it felt very video game-esque. And I figured with a follow-up story, there'd be great lengths taken from the author to try and avoid that, really trying to pull away from that criticism. But instead, it seems like, yeah, once again, Rob is just leaning into it, saying, no, this is what I do, but he elevates above that formula with the overall execution of this story. It's so rock solid. I'm just feeling like, yeah, I like an author who's willing to go, I see your criticism, but that's part of who I am. So I'm going to lean into it and make it better without pulling back. Brilliant. Still, I could see some people saying this is basically overcomplicated fetch quests. I understand that. I could see some issues with some of the world building, some of the characters, some of the pacing, but overall, this definitely appealed to me. And for Pawn's Gambit, I'm feeling a sturdy 8 out of 10. It's not going to change the face of fantasy forever, but in terms of having this book on your authorial resume, I think anyone would be proud. Now, next up, we have Old Man's War by John Scalzi. This is one of the most highly requested sci-fi books for me to review here on the channel, and I understand why. I really do get the appeal of Old Man's War. Unfortunately, I would just say it's not 100% for me. I have a lot of positive things to say about this book here, but I definitely have some pretty hefty criticisms as well. Let's go ahead and get into it. I look really washed out in this shirt. Oopsie. But I do want you to maintain, no matter how much I get into the flaws here, I do think this book is good. It just has some weaknesses that particularly hit sensitive spots for me on my enjoyment of a story. So let's go ahead and start with the concept. Old Man's War takes place in a futuristic vision for humanity, where the elderly are drafted into wars in space to fight over habitable planets with alien races. Already interesting. These elderly are given upgrades, which make them obviously suitable to fight in this war, and if they're able to do so for a couple of years, they're given a very nice retirement. Pleasant all the way around. I really like this premise for a couple of reasons. One, it heavily goes against the staple of fiction in general, where your protagonist is young. Granted, things are done to make him younger, but he's still an older protagonist, especially in his mind. Second reason is space wars are cool. That is a scientific fact. No other opinions are acceptable there. Space wars are awesome. And all of these elements are well realized. I like the wars. I like the setup of having to draft the elderly to fight, and the challenge of having to find and conquer habitable planets. Works out spectacularly. Those elements alone are enough for me to completely understand why Old Man's War has such an avid fan base out there that's been requesting for me to get to it for so long. Really enjoyable in those angles, and I absolutely liked those elements. And I see a continual recommendation that if you like Heinlein, you will like this story as well. I agree with that. This has a lot of the same appeals as Heinlein, especially if you're into like Starship Troopers specifically, 100%. The problems for me though come in with one especially strong core element, and that is going to be character. I did not really find myself attached to the main protagonist at all, or really anyone he encounters. That actually really surprised me, because I have a massive soft spot for elderly characters, older people characters I love. Like the beginning of Up, needed therapy after that. But there was this fundamental problem here where there was personality in the book. Everyone kind of vibed with this one personality. And so it ended up being like, yeah, there's flavor, but it's just one continual flavor that blankets over everyone. That meant it all kind of felt the same, and even our main protagonist really did not stand out to me because of that. Having people kind of ride that one kind of personality did provide plenty of levity. It was a pretty snarky, quick-witted, like, yeah, that's the way we talk here. It's just, it wasn't enough to justify it. Like, I went haha a few times, but I would have preferred to have a distinguishable cast of characters who I like could tell apart and really invest in who they are as a person. I also was just not a very big fan of the writing of action. It felt oversimplified, with especially how spoiled I've been recently with reading some absolutely stupendous action in sci-fi and fantasy. This just felt like a monstrous step down from where the bar has been set. And like, again, I'm very partial to space combat. Space combat is the coolest kind of combat. It's all directions. You can come from here, 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 here. Space combat's awesome. Doesn't matter if it's on a space station or a fighter. I love it. I just didn't love it here. And when so many of the characters turn into essentially cannon fodder, it kind of just made me eventually realize, like, why am I turning the pages? I have no investment in the people occupying them. But this is still good. I know I just unloaded a heaping of criticism, but it's just one solid angle I did not like. Overall, I still think this is an interesting read, and it's carried along by this concept and how well that concept is executed, along with some very fantastic world building. Thematically, quite a bit is done here as well through this concept and world building. I feel like it's unavoidable to have, like, yes, definite ideas to be explored. It just comes naturally with something like this, but the author did a commendable job of doing so. There's a lot of moral questions about fighting for habitable planets, the dehumanization of other aliens, dehumanizing things that are not, you know what I mean? I actually want to spend like a little bit extra time here on this because I think it's a really important point. When it came to Old Man's War, I felt like there was a thematic disconnect between what the book was trying to say and what actually happened in the pages and in our characters' thoughts. Now, there's a lot that goes on in terms of the ideas covered within these pages, from the motivations of war, the insecurities for society war can bring about, on the individual level, what happens to a person in war, the dehumanization of others, all this stuff I touched on. Yet, I feel like we should have refocused a little bit. The authorial hand pointing the reader's head just felt misguided, and where I ended up looking, and where anyone who reads this book can end up looking. For example, you really need to emotionally be able to allow us to exist in your main protagonist's shoes if you're going to be putting him in the situations the main character goes into this one's, and have the weight of loss that occurs. Yet instead, I found the main protagonist to come across emotionally castrated in some ways, where he didn't have the proper amount of reaction to certain things. I mean, a very blatant example is he has a son, but after there's like a little bit of a mention of a goodbye, he doesn't really come up again. Like, that should be a pretty dominating thought, I'd think, in this 75-year-old man who's going off to fight in war. You'd think he'd think about his child quite often, yet I can't really remember him thinking about his child much at all. Now, keeping that in mind, the setup and structure of this book was quite nice, and I definitely enjoyed the first half of the book more than the second. It's just once we got more into what was going on, without spoilers, in the latter half of the book, I just found myself going, there wasn't enough setup that was well done here to pay off what's being targeted. Basically, Old Man's War for me is going to land in the, I get it, I really do, but it's not my preference. So I'm going to land at a solid 6.5 out of 10 here. But these have been two books I really wanted to get to, so I'm excited to finally get these reviews out for you. Let me know what you thought of them in the comments down below, or join the conversation in the Discord server. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace. And of course, I'd like to record a special shout out to my latest high tier Patreon, Heron Heed. Hope that's how you say it. Have a good one. Peace. Let's start with the positive, though, and get into the concept and the execution of that concept. So Old Man's War is set in a space atmosphere.